They laughed when I said I owned a company. They called me the Wi-Fi guy at family parties. 3 months later, they saw my name on the cover of Forbes. Welcome to Reddit Stories. This is the place where we share real stories from anonymous Reddit users. And today you're about to hear the story of a husband, quiet, humble, and ignored by his in-laws for years. But what they didn't know was that the man they mocked as useless was quietly building an empire they would never, ever reach. My name is Julian, just an average man, or at least that's how I looked to everyone else. I drove an old car, wore simple clothes, and usually stayed quiet during family gatherings. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I chose not to say anything. My wife, Claire, she was the woman I once loved with everything I had. We met in college. She was stunning, a bit arrogant, and came from a wealthy family. A family where conversations revolved around business cards, luxury cars, and social status. I still remember the first time I met her family. Her mother looked me up and down like she was inspecting an outdated item on a shelf. "What's your major?" she asked, voice flat. "Finance, venture capital," I answered. Sounds unstable. Have you considered becoming a government employee instead?" I gave a polite smile. I knew I wasn't their type. No rich family, no connections, no luxury car, just an idea, and a co-founder. Together, we were building a cybersecurity startup from scratch. It was tough, it was risky, but I believed with enough hard work we'd make it. I thought that if I loved Claire genuinely, over time, her family would come to understand me. I was wrong. After we got married, Claire moved in with me into a small apartment. At the time, I kept quiet about the fact that our company had just landed its first government contract. I never told anyone how much was sitting in my bank account, or about the Tesla parked under the company's underground garage. I wanted to stay private. I wanted to see who loved me for me, not for my money. Claire was cheerful at first, but not long after, the comparisons began. "Jenny's husband just got her a Cartier bracelet," she said one day, scrolling Instagram. I smiled and handed her a cup of tea. "We don't need those things, do we?" I asked gently. Claire didn't answer, but slowly, the way she looked at me started to change. And before long, her eyes mirrored the same judgment her mother had that very first day. At every family party, I became invisible. They called me the IT guy, joked that I was the family's unpaid tech support. Every time I offered an opinion, it was dismissed with, "Julian, why don't you go focus on your little software thing?" Claire would laugh along with them, and I'd chuckle too, just to play along. But every word, every glance, I remembered it all. The breaking point came at my mother-in-law's birthday. I booked an entire restaurant, hired a live band, and personally picked out a handcrafted Italian silk scarf, her favorite kind. When I handed it to her, she glanced at it and gave a dismissive nod. "Oh, thanks. Simple but cute." Meanwhile, Claire gifted her a perfume she already owned and got praise for being so thoughtful. That was the moment I realized, no matter what I did, to them, I'd always be an outsider. And then came the day that changed everything. Claire's younger sister, Ava, was getting married. She dreamed of a grand wedding, chandeliers, violins, champagne towers. But Miles, her fiancé, didn't have the means. Claire told me about it one night. I thought about it, then quietly wrote a $15,000 check. "This is my wedding gift," I said. Claire hugged me tight, whispering, "You really are the best man ever." For a moment, I believed this would be the turning point. This time, surely, they'd see me differently. But 1 week before the wedding, I received a cold, one-line message. "Ava wants to keep the ceremony small and intimate. Hope you understand if you're not attending." I stared at my screen. My hands froze. My chest went cold. Me, the man who paid for the wedding, not on the guest list? I called Claire. "You're kidding. I'm not invited." She sighed. Ava didn't mean anything by it. She just didn't want to ruin the vibe. I laughed, bitterly. "I'm your husband, the one who paid for the whole thing. What part of the vibe doesn't suit me?" She didn't answer. And right then, I knew. I had been naive. That night, I sat alone, opened my wine cabinet, and poured myself a glass of red. the kind I save for celebrating million-dollar contracts. I looked around our small apartment, the one I once thought would be our forever home. But now, it just felt like a cage. I opened my laptop, clicked on a travel website. I wasn't going to that wedding. I wasn't going to wait for another fake apology. I wasn't going to beg for respect anymore. I was disappearing. And when I was gone, they'd realize what they'd just thrown away. You see, the man they thought was useless was about to walk out of their lives and start something none of them could ever imagine. I left home at dawn. No noise, no dramatic goodbye, just a small note on the kitchen counter. Wishing you and your family a truly intimate wedding. Julian. I rolled my suitcase out the front door. The same black suitcase I used for those business trips Claire thought were just IT training conferences. In reality, those trips were for pitching to investors, meeting partners, signing deals, the kind that made banks sit up straight when the numbers hit the page. This time, my destination was the Maldives. I booked a 5-star resort, beachfront villa, private pool, ocean view, and best of all, not a single familiar face in sight. The flight was smooth. The sky was blue like a painting. But inside me was a storm. Not because I was sad, but because I had finally realized I no longer needed to prove myself to people who never cared to understand me in the first place. I stretched out on a lounge chair beside my private pool, cocktail in hand, waves whispering their secrets to the shore. I unlocked my phone and saw a message from Claire. Where are you? I didn't think you were actually mad. Don't overreact. I didn't respond. Instead, I posted a short story. Wasn't invited, so I threw my own party. The photo? Me. Lying back on the chair, blue ocean behind me, a glass of Dom Perignon glowing under the sun. 30 minutes later, my phone started buzzing nonstop. Claire, Ava, even Lorraine, my mother-in-law, who never bothered to save my number. None of them apologized. They were just trying to do damage control. I turned the phone off, not out of anger, but because, for the first time in years, I felt light. Ava's wedding day arrived. I didn't watch, but I knew exactly what happened, thanks to Serena, Claire's cousin, the only person in that entire family who ever spoke to me like a human being. Julian, you won't believe it. Miles walked out, right in the middle of the reception. They were arguing about you. He said, if you can treat your own brother like that, then what am I to you? Then he stood up and left. I went still, then laughed. For the first time, someone finally saw me. And for the first time, I didn't have to say a single word. The truth shattered like a wine glass thrown to the floor, all on its own. While they scrambled to control the chaos, I was signing a new contract, a federal project, 7 figures, and the name on the signature line, Julian Hart, CEO and founder. And this was only the beginning. I would never return to the people who once treated me like air. I didn't need revenge, because they destroyed the very table they refused to give me a seat at. 3 days after the wedding, a video began making its rounds on social media. It showed the groom walking out of the reception, and just one sentence from Miles. If you can treat your own brother-in-law like this, what would you do to your husband? Sent the entire room into stunned silence. That line got clipped, overlaid with dramatic music, and shared hundreds of thousands of times. People were intrigued, curious. Who is Julian Hart? Claire sat curled up on the living room couch, her face pale, sleepless. Ava had locked herself in her room, refusing to come out. Lorraine turned to Claire, furious. This is your fault. You couldn't keep him. Men like Julian are rare. He's worth more than our whole family put together. Claire bit her lip hard. Everything was unraveling. She tried calling Julian, over and over, but every call went unanswered. Then she opened LinkedIn. Julian had only ever listed a single vague job description there, freelance IT consultant. But now, right at the top of his profile, a brand new post was lighting up the feed. Proud to have closed the biggest federal contract of my career. Grateful to the team who helped turn this dream into reality. Julian Hart, CEO and founder, Virion Tech. Beneath the post were hundreds of congratulatory comments. One read, "Can't believe you stayed silent this long. Now the whole country knows who Julian really is." Claire dropped her phone. Her hands trembled. She had never imagined that the man in plain shirts, driving that old car, the one her mother mocked at every chance, was actually the CEO of a tech company now worth tens of millions. That very night, Serena called Claire. "You really messed everything up. Did you know? Julian once invited me to visit his office, but he asked me not to tell anyone. I thought he was just some nerd obsessed with code. I had no idea." Claire didn't reply. Her mind flashed through all the times she belittled him. "Can't you buy yourself a decent shirt for once? Why are you always glued to that stupid phone? If you keep living like this, what kind of example will you set for our kids someday?" Now it all made sense. She had lived next to a diamond and never once realized its worth. The next morning, Claire went to the Virion Tech office. She stood at the reception desk, speaking quietly. I'm Claire, someone from his past. May I see Julian?" The receptionist smiled politely. "I'm sorry. Our CEO is in meetings all day today. Would you like to leave a message?" Claire lowered her head, fighting back tears. For the first time, she was the one being dismissed, coldly, just like she and her family had once treated Julian. That night, Claire sat on the balcony of their apartment, scrolling through their old wedding photos. Julian's eyes in the pictures, so gentle, so humble. She had grown so used to that quiet presence that she forgot. Behind it was an ocean she never took the time to explore. But now it was too late. Julian was no longer the neglected husband. He was the man who stood up, walked away, and left behind everyone who ever looked down on him. I thought that after that disastrous wedding, everything would finally calm down. But I was wrong. The moment Miles walked out of that wedding, the moment I posted that simple caption online, that was the beginning of an entirely new chapter in my life. That morning, as I sat by the pool of my private villa, sipping on an espresso, Serena called me. "Julian, have you checked Twitter yet? The whole startup community is obsessed with you." I raised an eyebrow. "They're calling you the silent CEO, the man who played poor and got disrespected by his in-laws but still funded their dream wedding. And rumor has it you never revealed your real identity because you didn't want the spotlight." I smiled slightly. That wasn't a rumor. It was the truth. For 3 years, I'd been working in the shadows, on purpose, building before bragging. But now, the light found me on its own. A headline on Forbes read, "The man behind an $80 million cybersecurity company excluded from a wedding he paid for." Within 24 hours, my inbox exploded. Investors, VC funds, journalists, everyone wanted a piece of the story. "Are you open to raising funds? Would you be willing to share your journey?" Even the same people who used to ignore me were now circling back to say they admired me. That night, Dave, my closest business partner, FaceTimed me. "Bro, do I have to start calling you a social media legend now?" I laughed. "Don't. I just lived honestly and stayed quiet at the right time." But while the world was calling me a poster boy for quiet success, Claire was falling apart under the weight of the truth. She had finally seen it. Seen everything. All the money I ever brought home. All the late nights. The 2 a.m. emails I answered in silence. They weren't the signs of a jobless drifter, like she once thought. 3 days later, I got an email. From Claire. Subject, "I'm in Maldives. Can we talk?" I didn't reply. But that evening, the villa manager approached me. "Mr. Hart, there's a woman named Claire at the gate. She says she's your wife." I stepped out onto the balcony, and there she was, hair messy, eyes swollen, a suitcase at her side, hand trembling in the sun. Claire, no longer the proud woman who once told me, "You embarrassed me with that beat-up car." I walked downstairs, opened the gate. She looked up at me, eyes glassy, lips trembling. "Julian, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know you were." I raised my hand, gently cutting her off. You didn't need to know who I was, Claire. You just needed to not look down on me. And that's exactly what you did. She broke down. I was wrong. I listened to Ava, to Mom. I thought you were just a simple man. I never realized behind your silence was an entire empire. I looked at her, and honestly, I wasn't angry anymore. Just empty. I invited her in. Not because I still loved her, but because I refused to become heartless. I was still Julian, the man who once loved her for a decade, the man who would have given anything to keep her safe. She sat on the villa's sofa, staring around at the oceanfront view, then back at me. I never realized you were living this well. I replied, calmly, it's not living well, Claire. It's living right. And finally, you're seeing what I tried to hide for so many years. Claire clasped her hands tightly. Please give me one more chance. Just this once. I'll fix it. I swear. I shook my head slowly. You don't need to fix us, Claire. You need to fix your own life. And that doesn't require being a part of mine. She collapsed, sobbing. I just sat there, steady. They say I'm the man who stays silent at the right time. But Claire, sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the only way to let people open their eyes on their own. That night, I walked her to a taxi. Before the door closed, she asked one last question. So, is this goodbye? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, it's not goodbye, Claire. This is the first time I've ever truly said farewell to someone who left me a long time ago. The car pulled away. Claire looked back one last time, and I turned toward the villa. For the first time in years, I felt light. Eight months after Claire stood outside the villa gate in 104-degree Maldives heat, crying under the sun, I was now standing on a very different stage. A grand hall, lights glowing against the backdrop behind me. Future Vision Tech Summit, New York. Spotlights lit my face. In front of me were hundreds of people. CEOs, investors, journalists, young dreamers, and startup founders. They didn't know I'd once been called a leech inside my own home. They only knew one name now, Julian Hart, the man who pretended to be poor, built a $120 million startup, and got excluded from the wedding he paid for. I looked toward the front row, and I saw a familiar face, Claire. She sat quietly, no makeup, no expensive dress, just a woman in the shadows, alone. No one recognized her, but I did, and I knew why she was here today. I began my speech, voice low, slow, clear. I once lived in a house where people laughed when I said I had a dream. I once pulled out my wallet to pay $15,000 for a wedding I wasn't invited to. The room went completely still. I took one step forward. The lights followed, and I once believed that I wasn't good enough, not worthy enough, until I stopped trying to be good for people who never truly valued me. Right then, I saw Claire lower her head. I knew she was crying, but I didn't stop. I played poor. I hid my real job. I stayed silent, just to see who would love me for me, not for what I had. And I failed, but that failure was the beginning of everything I have now. The audience erupted into applause. A long, thunderous round of applause. But for me, the only sound I could truly hear was the quiet sob of the woman who once called me a burden, now sitting there, realizing she had pushed away the only person who ever stood by her side. After the talk, I walked backstage. A young staff member ran up to me. Mr. Julian, there's a woman named Claire. She's waiting in the hallway. She says she wants to speak with you alone. I paused, then slowly shook my head. Tell her, Julian Hart no longer lives in the world where she once walked in heels and looked down on people. He now lives in a place where silence is respected, and hearts are heard, not trampled. I turned around and walked toward the waiting car. The New York wind swept across my jacket, carrying with it the last remnants of a past long buried. And I knew at that very moment, I was no longer the man, excluded from a wedding. I was the man who had just thrown his own graduation ceremony for self-worth. And that's the end of the story. If you, too, have ever been overlooked, dismissed, undervalued, remember this. Silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it's just you, waiting for the right moment to remind the world that your presence is a gift, not an obligation. Studio Microphone, welcome to Reddit Stories, and thank you for listening to a true tale, shared by someone anonymous but deeply real. See you in the next story.